All right, welcome back. This is American Federal Government. Welcome to class. My name is Ken Hicks. We've been talking about the role of the media in the political process. And of course, one thing that recently has happened, 2 weeks ago, southern states of Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, and North Carolina got hit by a devastating hurricane, Hurricane Helene. And then, of course, just last night, another hurricane crossed Florida around the around the Tampa Bay area and across the state. These are things that, again, the media, part of the media's job is to provide people with information. And so it's very important that most media have weather capabilities. They have meteorologists on staff that can tell people. One of the things that was really disturbing about this latest hurricane, Hurricane Milton, is that it was a Category 5 as it was approaching Florida, which is the highest category, highest wind gusts and all that kind of stuff. If you know, hurricanes kind of travel in a clockwise manner, and there are these kind of waves that come along with it, and it pushes enormous amounts of water. The fear was that this would go into Tampa Bay and cause like a really major, devastating flood event. They were warning people in that area, especially in the low-lying areas, that hunkering down was really not an option, that you could die if 14 feet of water came on shore. Fortunately, it didn't go into Tampa Bay. It kind of went a little bit south. And the weather events are usually on the worst on the right side of the eye of a hurricane. And so we were kind of fortunate. At the same time, we're dealing with a problem that has been ongoing since Helene, which we are dealing with two things: weather calamities, and also a presidential election. We're within 30 days now of a very tight election, and some people are using this disaster as a fodder for the campaign. And this is sort of problematical. It's happened before. Hurricane Sandy occurred in like literally a couple of weeks before the 2012 elections, and at that time it hit the upstate New Jersey, New York area. And of course, kind of famously, the governor at the time, Chris Christie, was seen embracing Barack Obama, and they worked in tandem, and they successfully kind of managed what was a pretty bad weather event. And unfortunately, some Republicans learned the wrong lesson from that, which is that you always have to be partisan, and that is a problem with how our politics is working these days. So the media is, again, they have these three very important functions, right? They provide information to the public. They provide a forum for people who are campaigning for office, and then they act as a watchdog for corruption and malfeasance. So what are we learning today? We're going to continue talking about the sources of political news, the shift from television to online for many Americans. We're going to talk about the quality of political news and some of the challenges with this with immediacy comes a lot of misinformation. And then we're just going to talk a little bit about the media itself, what we think about it. So there are a lot of sources of political news. Again, I mentioned in my first presentation on the media, initially newspapers were the dominant media from colonial times until well into the late 19th and early 20th century. And then radio began displacing newspapers as the primary way that people were getting news. It's interesting that radio, in fact, was where you began to see regulation of the media, and that really began in the 1920s with the Radio Act and the creation of the regulatory agencies. And to no small extent, it's one of the ironies. At the time, the Secretary of Commerce, Herbert Hoover, said he'd never seen an industry more eager to be regulated. And the reason was they wanted the bandwidth regulated because it was considered, under American jurisprudence, the airwaves are public property. They wanted the airwaves regulated so that they could monetize. because at the time they were dealing with a great deal of competition for the bandwidth from ham radio operators and independent operators, and they wanted to narrow down access so that they could create programming that they could use to mimic the penny press, that idea of grabbing an audience and selling it advertising. So increasingly what we have seen with the advent first of CNN in 1980 and then with Fox News in 1997, you're increasingly seeing partisan media that is occupying more and more space and drawing larger and larger audiences. So some news organizations mingle opinion with factual journalism to appeal to people who are more ideologically motivated. And again, this is one of the it's a chicken and egg kind of question, right? Does the media cause partisan polarization, or is it merely symptomatic of partisan polarization? But in a lot of these, when you're dealing with Fox News, and to some extent when you're dealing with MSNBC, there's really little effort made to establish a journalistic balance. And again, I mentioned, I believe, the fairness doctrine, that really began in the 1940s and persisted into the 1980s. The fairness doctrine basically mandated that media, that license holding media, it had to, if they were dealing with political programming, they had to be balanced. They had to show both sides of an issue. Getting rid of the fairness doctrine led us down this path towards returning to increasingly more partisan journalism. So that oftentimes contributes to a kind of zero-sum media environment, right? If you live in Fox world, you think that the Biden-Harris administration has utterly failed at providing relief for Helen, for Hurricane Helen victims in places like North Carolina. And I think I mentioned, part of the problem with with how the hurricane hit North Carolina is that it went into upstate areas that are not really typically prone to flooding and dumped huge amounts of water, because climate change has meant that hurricanes are carrying much larger loads of water on shore, and we have less and less kind of the things, like mango swamps, and large sand areas that absorb huge amounts of water, and especially that's not the case in mountainous areas of North Carolina. And that the problem is doubled by the fact that because it's mountainous, a lot of times those roads become impassable, and these are, these communities like Asheville, for example, become really, really hard to get to. So you have to mobilize helicopters and get things in. It takes a little time to recognize the challenge and to get the resources in place to manage these kinds of events. But in the midst of a campaign season, you have one side saying they're doing everything they can. You have the other side saying they're an utter failure. That is really a zero-sum media environment, right? And depending on what media you're listening to, it's going to have a dramatic impact on how you think about, the news that you're getting. So again, when you look at how people perceive the news, obviously conservatives view MSNBC as a tainted network that is obviously partisan, and we don't have to think of and listen to anything that they have to say. And MSNBC viewers feel the same way about Fox News. And so that really creates, again, an environment where they don't really care what the other side is thinking. They're speaking past one another. They literally live in different worlds, okay? So how is the news delivered? I mean, again, historically, it was delivered via newspapers. People either went to newsstands or they paid for a subscription and had the news delivered to their door. So again, traditional broadcast communications now involve, publisher, the great transition to TV meant that all the people had to do was really turn on their televisions, and then eventually they had to pay for some kind of cable subscription. But again, that was simply kind of a passive, expense. You didn't have to go out and get the news. The news came to you. You could sit on the couch and get all the news you needed. So increasingly today, you have news websites that are digital. They're owned and managed by newspapers and that follow, again, traditional journalistic practices. I get my news online, but I get it from I have subscriptions to the Washington Post and to the New York Times. I would do the Wall Street Journal, but frankly, they're too expensive. I have a lot of other kinds of varieties of news media that are on my news feed that I routinely scroll through, and I read a lot of stuff every day on a day-to-day basis. So again, the move to digital delivery has had the effect of resuscitating some of the larger, what we call papers of record. And when we talk about the papers of record, what we're really talking about is the foundation of the day-to-day journalism as it relates to politics. When you're talking about, again, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, several of the largest of the city papers, the Orlando Sentinel, the Dallas Morning News, the Chicago Tribune, the LA Times, these are kind of all collectively constitute papers of record to the extent that they do a lot of original reporting. They retain large staffs. They are considered to be expert over their particular, metropolitan areas. The Washington Post has been a real innovator in the development of digital content, and that, kind of reflects the fact that you have the owner of Amazon who is now the owner of the Washington Post. You always have to do kind of a full disclosure when you see the Washington Post reporting on Amazon, because again, frankly, Jeff Bezos has, some say. Now, to date, and to Jeff Bezos's credit, to date, he has been relatively hands-off in terms of what kind of content goes into the Washington Post on a day-to-day basis. But there is room, again, you're seeing this convergence of media. There are fewer and fewer media owned by, bigger and bigger corporations. And again, now you have instances where very significant media outlets like the Washington Post, owned by Jeff Bezos, and now X, owned by Elon Musk. And again, why is X a significant source for the media? Well, because a lot of original stuff gets, ends up in what used to be Twitter. Because major politicians, of course, Barack Obama had a Twitter account and would routinely post on it. Trump exploited Twitter extensively as president of the United States and really used it as a political cudgel against anyone that criticized him or seemed to be opposing him. And so, you have, this convergence in media. And, which is worse, that, the government could censor media, or that corporations who own the media would censor it themselves. Self-censorship is still censorship. And the reality is American news organizations do a poor job of acting as a watchdog on corporate America. The more money, that a company controls, the less likely it is that they're going to get a lot of hostile media attention from American media, who are reliant on official sources, right, for the news. And so, there is also this concept called indexing, where, again, on issues where there is wide agreement, the media is very reluctant to say anything critical. I'll give you an example. I talked about Ta-Nehisi Coates' book Messages. His essay on Israel is controversial in America. It's probably not particularly controversial in Europe, because Europe and European media are much more consistently critical of Israel. But in America, there is a broad consensus that they support the Israeli sovereignty, the Israelis' right both to exist and to defend itself, and that really precludes much in the way of criticism of how they're prosecuting the war in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere. And so Coates, in making that kind of criticism, really is bucking a consensus, and that takes a certain amount of courage. And courage is not something you're often going to find in people that do things to make money. Money and courage are oftentimes kind of inversely related to one another. There are lots and lots of news aggregators out there. These are websites that pull together content from a wide range of online sources. They'll often offer ways of avoiding hyper-partisan news. Examples of news aggregators are, Google News, Reddit, Real Clear Politics. These are kind of all prominent examples of news aggregators. And again, if you're going to a news aggregator and getting most of your information, you're also, kind of in a skim and scan kind of mode. You're just mainly looking at headlines. You're looking at oftentimes of kind of synopses of stories. So you're really not getting the kind of in-depth reporting that you would get if you were going to, a paper of record, for example. Social media are again increasing. I mentioned X a little while ago. Their social media sites are again, they're diverse, they're interactive, they're convenient. In 2020 or by 2020, over 36% of adults got a significant amount of their news from Facebook. And again, that raises the question of algorithms, of what a social media website like X, like social media, presents to you. The more you display an interest in a particular issue, the more of those kinds of stories you're going to get. Now, at some level, that's a good thing, right? That's, you want to see the stories that you want to see. At the same time, it trends us in, left, right directions, in a particular issue. And it oftentimes has the tendency of leading you to more and more extreme content as it relates to, to social media and how they do the news. So they personalize content, they give you what you want to a very extreme extent. And that kind of engagement data has been demonstrated to have potentially harmful effects on users. Instagram, for example, they internally did studies where they produced significant evidence that young women were developing very negative body images because of what they were seeing on Instagram and TikTok and other kinds of shows, and that they just suppressed that evidence, and they really didn't do anything about the harm that their product was causing to people, which is incredibly disturbing and something, again, in the way of government should probably be considered. Obviously right now they're talking about just getting rid of TikTok because TikTok originates as a Chinese company, and there is wide agreement that the Chinese Communist Party, that the Chinese government has some influence over TikTok, and so they have basically been given a period of time either to divest and sell to an American company, or they're going to be shut down in the United States. So I think that's, again, an important development. At the same time, there is a need for regulation of these huge social media platforms. And the question is, how are you going to do it? Are you going to do it in ways that minimize harm to consumers while, again, retaining that capacity for these social media sites to make money? Or are you just going to, again, how you regulate is important. Television remains the major source of news for most, Americans. 2/3 of Americans get at least some of their news from television. Local TV news routinely attracts 25 million viewers nightly, mainly to get the weather. It seems to be the main selling attraction for the local news. Certain demographic groups watch more television than others, and that's obviously, again, older Americans, and also people that are just coming into adulthood. Again, if you're an older American, you're retired, you've got a lot of time around the house, and a lot of people spend a lot of that time sitting in front of the television, watching, Again, depending on what your preferences are. A lot of older Americans watch the Hallmark Channel and watch rom-com after rom-com. A lot of older Americans watch cable news and turn it on and keep it on all day long. And again, that has intensifying effects on their political outlet, on their political outlook. Television news, again, tends to be superficial. When you look at any nightly news, you are generally looking, news production crews, spend their day looking at the Washington Post and the New York Times and making decisions as to, which stories, and remember, nightly network news, the national news programs have about a half an hour. And so they have to prioritize what are the 5 to 7 stories that we're going to try and fit in to that evening program. If you say it's a half-hour program, what it really means is it's 22 minutes because they also have to sell advertising during those periods. Okay. Radio and podcasts remain relevant sources of news. Radio rapidly declined as the principal source for news in the 1950s as more and more Americans. This reflected an enormous economic expansion in the post-World War II era. If you remember, during World War II, a lot of people didn't have money they didn't have goods to spend because you had rationing that was going into the war effort, and so a lot of people over the course of the 4.5 years of World War II stockpiled large amounts of money, and they had all this pent-up spending power, from 1946 until, well into the 1950s. And they suddenly had things that they could buy that they couldn't have conceived buying before. Things like refrigerators and televisions and, the things, the accessories that we take for granted today were suddenly available to working class and middle class people. And that purchase of that first TV for a family was, that was the moment that a lot of people said, we have arrived, right? So television is a less common source for the news, but 1/4 of Americans prefer to get their news from radio and podcasts. And a lot of this is dads that sit in their garage and they work on, their car, or they're working on, they've got a wood shop or something like that, and they turn the radio on, and they'll either be listening to a baseball game, or they'll be listening to, talk radio. And a lot of, again, in the 1980s, you had, the rise of these partisan talk radio hosts like Rush Limbaugh. And a lot of people that mimicked him, that are still around today. People like Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity and, a lot of the folks further, even further to the right. And they run hours-long programs on, kind of overtly partisan political topics. And again, that need to be talking, has led to the steady intensification of talk radio. And so many of the sources of extremism that you're seeing in America today originate from, talk radio and from podcasts. So the lifting of the fairness doctrine facilitated the rise of these shock jocks like Rush Limbaugh and their imitators. And today you've got a guy like, Joe Rogan, who has gotten a $100 million contract from Sirius Radio to run a 4-hour-long daily podcast. And $100 million is a lot of money. Joe Rogan is, not college educated. He's not a dumb person by any means. He's largely self-educated. He is capable of adopting very sophisticated takes on a lot of very complex issues. But he's also got 4 hours to fill every day. And he occasionally fills his programming with some, stuff that is probably not strictly speaking, truthful. I don't think he is deliberately not being truthful. But again, you've got these moments where you've got over 4-hour periods in free-flowing conversation. If any of you have watched a Joe Rogan program, he's got, no doubt he prepares. He's got a list of questions that he's going to ask. But a lot of it is just, stuff. I'd use a word, but it kind of reflects what happens when cows eat a lot of food. But a lot of it is just of that nature, and that's just what is going into our media ecology. And again, this guy knows a lot more about MMA than he does about politics. Newspapers remain, again, and they are kind of the canary in the coal mine of American media. They're the oldest news medium. Just 5% of Americans these days read print newspapers, and I think you can infer that a significant percentage of that 5% are greatest generation and baby boomers like myself. And they are aging out. They are rapidly, facing demographic realities, okay? The emergence of for-profit newspapers at the turn of the 19th century, again, established a template for news distribution. It is a profit-making enterprise. You grab an audience by providing a reliable news product, and then you sell that audience advertising. That has been the most consistent way that media organizations have made money throughout American history. And again, the move to digital content rescued some of the larger newspapers, as I mentioned before. But one of the biggest victims of what's happening, with our media environment is that small town print newspapers are dying because they lack the resources to develop the digital content. They lack the local reporting that you need. And they simply don't have, in many instances, they're not dying, they're being killed. My wife is fond of, if I say, oh, this thing broke, she says, did it break or did you break it? In a lot of instances, small print newspapers are dying because they've been bought by large corporations. And those corporations are basically saying, every quarter, I need profits because I need to send money back to shareholders. And if you can't give me 15% profit reliably, then you're not profitable. Now, local newspapers have never been that profitable, okay? Maybe 2% profit, maybe 5% profit, in a good quarter, maybe 7 or 8% profit. They just generally don't make 15% profit. And so what happens? They have to cannibalize their news organization, lay off reporters, rely more and more on subscription, reporting from AP and which is the Associated Press, which is an organization that hires journalists and freelance journalists and becomes sort of a main kind of central distribution point. They then sell that to media organizations like print newspapers. Well, what you get there is sort of the USA Today-ization of local news. And, most people don't want to buy a local newspaper to get that kind of content. And so local newspapers are, dying off. It used to be towns the size of Claremore would have 2 newspapers. They'd oftentimes have, a set of news for the more liberal part of town and a set of news for the more conservative part of town. That really began to end around the middle of the 20th century. And even in the larger cities, like for example, you had in Atlanta, I'm familiar with Atlanta because I'm from Georgia, you had the Atlanta Journal, which was the conservative newspaper, and then you had the Atlanta Constitution. And the Constitution was the much larger distribution because it dealt with again, issues that dealt with, with the increasingly, black population of Atlanta, to the point where eventually the Atlanta Journal could no longer afford to distribute a newspaper. And so ultimately what happened was the Atlanta Constitution kind of took in the Atlanta Journal, hired some of their editors, hired some of their reporters, and it became the Atlanta Journal-Constitution in the 1970s. And that happened nationally in a lot of places, in a lot of larger metro areas. Now, New York City is different because New York City is, it is the financial hub of the United States. It is one of the most densely populated areas in North America, north of Mexico. Mexico City is the largest city in North America. And so it's got room for the New York Times and the New York Post. But that's the exception, really not the rule. So who are Americans? How do Americans get their political news? When you look again at the percentage of adults who often get or sometimes get news from their smartphone or from their, or from a tablet, 60% of Americans do often, and 26% of Americans do sometimes. Television remains, again, very significant. Often 40%, sometimes 28%. Radio, 34% get their news. I get my news I get some news from radio. I have my preset for NPR every morning when I'm driving to work and driving from work, which is not a very long drive. I listen to NPR. And that's how a lot of people are. 16% often, though. So again, it's beginning to get inverted. Print publications, only 10% of Americans often read print newspapers. And again, I can be an illustration of that. I don't have a subscription to any newspapers, but I will often get the Sunday edition of the Claremore Progress just to see what's in the paper. I will oftentimes buy a copy of the Sunday edition of the Tulsa World. Again, just to see what's going on, because Sunday is the main, that's the big tamale. That's where, that's the big package for most print news these days. So what digital platforms do people, consume news and information? News websites and apps, again, 34%. Online searches, 41%, at least sometimes. Social media, podcasts, again, these are important sources of news. How do people consume news by age? Younger Americans increasingly are going to digital media. A lot of older Americans, almost 50% of older Americans have gone, again, I'm kind of an older American now, and I get a lot of my news from digital content. Television, again, look at it. Older Americans, over 70% are basically reliant on television. Radio, again, it's a much smaller group. In print, the largest group, of course, are people over 65. But again, I had my dad was like one of those kind of guys. He said, I like the smell of a newspaper. I like the ink it gets on my fingers. I like having to wash my hands after I read the news, right? There's just a tactile feel kind of thing for some people. It's kind of like, people that buy books. I'm a book buyer. But I also have a Kindle. If I think I might like a book, but I don't really want to spend the money I would want to spend on a hardback book, I'll just buy it on Kindle because it's typically going to be about 40% cheaper. So you have the rise of media technology companies. Again, big technology companies have occupied significant roles in the business of journalism. Big tech sweeps up, again, large amounts of advertising revenue. And the use, again, of these media algorithms pushes content towards consumers that has the effect, first and foremost, of making you spend more, which is what they want, but it also facilitates polarization, right? We're already polarized. Social media, these media technology companies are intensifying that tendency because there's money to be made, right? So again, the effect of big tech on the media, they're creating or buying major news organizations. They have very differing approaches to politics. There are increasing controversies that surround accusations, again, of partisan bias and misinformation. Think about X again. First of all, Elon Musk spent over $40 billion purchasing Twitter and then changing it radically. He got rid of a lot of content moderation. And now he has gone from, on what many people who understand the tech industry and who have interacted with Elon Musk, as a matter of personal grievance, he has switched from being sort of a moderate libertarian to being a far-right guy that has committed to spending $40 million a month to get Donald Trump elected. That kind of capriciousness is increasingly a disturbing aspect of our media politics. You've got a guy whose control of Tesla and Sky and Starlink and X make him almost a state unto himself, right? Where he's basically having people from foreign governments visiting him to try and influence his behavior. And he has control over a significant aspect of our media politics. So again, you know, when you think about it, Donald Trump, following the January 6th Capitol insurrection, was, you know, the permanent ban from Facebook and banned, you know, indefinitely from Twitter. Because again, he was using those social media sites to attempt to overthrow and overturn the results of the 2020 presidential election. And so, you know, there was serious question about, you know, the extent to which those social media platforms were complicit in those attempts. And those social media companies have adopted differing approaches to how they are approaching, you know, to how different approaches to politics. For example, Meta's owner, which is also Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, during the 2020 elections, he basically extended money to local governments so that they could better manage local elections during the pandemics, and faced fierce criticism as a result. He was accused of putting his thumb on the election to favor you know, Democrats. Because again, one thing that we know is that typically high turnout events result in you know, good fortune for Democrats. Zuckerberg's response to that has been to back away from politics pretty aggressively. He has attempted to adopt a neutral stance as it relates to politics. That contrasts starkly with Elon Musk, who has, again, he appeared with Donald Trump at the place in Pennsylvania where he was nearly assassinated, where he had a bullet graze as a result of an attempted assassination. He's now appearing with Donald Trump. He did an interview with Donald Trump after he determined that he was going to endorse Trump. And again, that raises the question, you know, people with these kinds of resources, you know, they have a disproportionate influence over the political process. So the quality of news is an essential question that we have to ask ourselves, you know, if we really believe in freedom of the press. It's not just the press is free, you know, from government censorship. They also have an obligation to provide Americans with good information. So what do Americans think about the media? Trust in the news is linked to views about the media's influence. And COVID-19 exerted a profound effect of causing lots of Americans to lose trust in both the media and in expertise generally. Again, one of the problems was, you know, we'd had a couple of scares over the course of the 2000s. With, you know, the H1N1, you know, flu and things like that. You know, Zika, the Zika virus. I'm not an immunologist. I can tell you kind of in broad terms that the problem with COVID-19 was that it was not terribly virulent. It didn't kill everyone that it encountered. This is sort of the vector you have with diseases, right? If they're really, really easily communicable, they're typically not terribly virulent, right? The flu is, you know, it spreads widely. Most people get at least some exposure to it, but rarely do we get more than 30,000 people a year that die from the flu. COVID-19 was spreading very rapidly and killing 2% of the people that got it. Now, you know, if 100 million people are catching this kind of a virus, and it's killing 2%, that's a lot of dead people. Okay, and so the problem was It wasn't entirely novel. It was a kind of avian coronavirus. We knew that. We didn't have a vaccine for it. And so, even immunologists and epidemiologists and other disease experts at the Centers for Disease Control struggled for a period of time to adopt policies. For example, they talked about the 6-foot, distancing. They kind of pulled that, that number, 6 feet, out of the air. It was something where they had to make a decision on very short notice, and 6 feet seemed like a safe distance. But it didn't have a lot of science to back it up, okay? Likewise, the Capitol riot, again, had a profound effect on trust in the media. When you think about it, a lot of the paranoia that Trump was cheated out of the election was amplified by conservative media outlets like Breitbart, like Fox News, like Newsmax, like One America. They were doing everything in their power to stoke people's grievance and the sense at which the election was somehow stolen. And in fact, they had they paid significant consequences for that, because in many instances they were libeling people, like Fox News and Newsmax. Both have been sued by Dominion and Smartmatic. These are both voting machines, and they were airing allegations that had no basis in fact, that the voting machines were somehow being manipulated. There is no evidence to support that. There are tons of internal documents suggesting that people at Fox News knew that what they were putting on air was not true. That displayed a reckless disregard for the truth. And Dominion was suing them for more than $1 billion, and they ultimately ended up settling the suit for $787 million. Now, that's not a huge sum of money for Fox News, but it ain't chump change either. It was a blow to their corporate profits and to their shareholders and to management, which is basically dominated by Rupert Murdoch and his children. And they now have another extensive lawsuit that's confronting them from Smartmatic, where they're being sued for $2 billion. And again, that process is going to begin pretty shortly. And you're again going to see a replay of a lot of the internal documents from Fox News, from texts to emails, basically discussing internally what they were saying about these media companies and whether it was accurate or not. So again, as I mentioned, when we're talking about the functions of the news, the more the news, as they play a forum for for candidates, as they act as a watchdog, that raises questions about their motivations and whether they're partisan or not. So when you look at these different organizations and how people feel about them, Democrats and leaning Democrats have had declining trust in certain news organizations, especially like the national news organizations. Trust went from close to 80% among Democrats to it declined at least about 10%. Look at the group where trust declined the most, right? From trust being roughly 60% among Republicans and leaning Republicans, it declined to probably in the 40% partisan news that was giving them a loaded product. When you look at social media, trust was always pretty low. And again, it rose briefly over COVID and then declined sharply as we approached the 2020 election, because it was obvious that there was tons of misinformation that was on a lot of social media sites. So you have dramatic partisan differences in trust, in the ability of the media to impartially execute their watchdog function. For a lot of Americans think they're not watchdogs, they're attack dogs, and they're attacking my guy. And again, Donald Trump has played a big role because, again, what does he say anything that's critical of him? What's the two words he uses persistently? Fake news, right? So we increasingly have a polarized information environment, and there are legitimately concerns that in some instances there is media bias. Confirmation bias involves what we call preaching to the choir, where again, MSNBC knows their audience. They know what their audience wants. When you're giving your audience what they want as opposed to what they need to know, that is creating a problem. You also have the reality of filter bubbles. These are partisan media that feed viewers what they want to hear, and viewers rarely break out of that bubble. And then you have echo chambers that amplify or reinforce viewers' belief through the repetition inside a closed communication system. One of the key elements of propaganda is that you give them the same bits of information over and over and over again, and that repetition eventually causes people to believe that it's the truth. Roughly 1/4 of Americans exist in a closed information system. And that is, again, a significant problem with how Americans kind of consume the news. So again, when you look at party identification of media consumers, the table on the slide shows the percentage of people who get political and election news recently from each source, right? So which sources have the largest gap between Democrats and Republicans? Fox News, 39% of all Americans. Only 23% of Democrats watch Fox News. And I guarantee you they're watching it because they want to, they're basically they want their blood pressure raised or something like that. But 60% of Republicans get their news from Fox. ABC gets 33% of all adults, 37% Democrats, 30% of Republicans. CBS News, 33% of Democrats, 26% of Republicans. NBC News, 40% of Democrats, 28% of Republicans. CNN, 53% Democrats, 24% Republicans. NPR, 30% Democrats, 11% Republicans. New York Times, 30% Democrats, 9% Republicans. Washington Post, 26% Democrats, 8% Republicans. What this reflects is, even among mainstream news outlets, Republicans have declining trust that they're actually giving them information that is accurate, because they have been told over and over again that the mainstream media is biased. So, misinformation. What is the difference between misinformation and disinformation? For misinformation, examples abound, including the viral rumors started by QAnon that alleged that a cabal of political elites were, in reality, a satanic cult that drank the blood of children, which resulted in what was known as Pizzagate, which was, based on the rumor that went viral in the D.C. area. That there was a pizza place where people came and where kids were bled for their blood that these people would drink from. And a guy broke into the pizza place believing that he was rescuing children. Likewise, the rumor that went viral claiming that Haitian immigrants were eating household pets in Springfield, Ohio. That's an example of misinformation. It's misinformation. Well, I'll add to that. Disinformation is more of a intelligence-related phenomenon. For example, during the Cold War, the Soviet Union spread rumors that the AIDS virus was created in an American chemical weapons lab and deliberately unleashed on America's minority communities. Another example was the role that Russia played in weaponizing the Democratic National Committee's emails, as well as Russia's role in generating fake news stories aimed at discrediting Hillary Clinton during the 2016 presidential campaign. RT, Russia, it was called Russia Today, was a major kind of amplifier of a lot of that disinformation. Many of the stories disseminated during the 2016 campaign originated in Russian troll farms organized by the Russian Internet Research Agency, which is a Russian intelligence agency. Okay, so both refer to false or misleading information. Misinformation may originate from innocent misunderstandings. Disinformation involves the deliberate distribution of false information in pursuit of a political goal. Again, recently, Donald Trump was claiming that FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Administration, didn't have any money because the Biden administration had emptied its coffers to give to immigrants. That is disinformation. That is clearly false. FEMA has enough money to manage current recovery efforts in those states affected by hurricanes Helene and Milton. They need future appropriations because, frankly, Helene was a devastating hurricane. You basically budget for a normal hurricane season, and you make estimates based on, the recovery expenses from a typical hurricane season. Helene is going to be unique. Okay, it's caused hundreds of billions of dollars more in damage than you're typically going to find. That's going to require a multi-year appropriation of hundreds of billions of dollars to help those communities recover. It's not fair, that these communities were devastated by an act of God, right? Misinformation in the time of COVID was extensive. Again, you had the viral nature of misinformation, which was intensified by the uncertainty of public health professionals in the early days of the pandemic. Social media oftentimes played a role in spreading misinformation. When you look, for example, again, Joe Rogan, at one point he contracted COVID, and he told his viewers that he had taken ivermectin. Now, again, there was a lot of pushback from public health experts, which were basically saying there's no evidence that ivermectin is actually helping. That was actually intensified because, again, he got ivermectin from a doctor. It was almost definitely a human. There are two kinds of or actually multiple kinds of ivermectin. Ivermectin, in simple terms, is a deworming product. And so you have ivermectin for ruminant animals, for horses and cows, and then you have ivermectin as a dewormer for human beings. And it's very effective at deworming. We're not sure that it's effective at stopping COVID. Nevertheless, Rogan said he did that. Health experts pushed back on him, accusing him of being irresponsible. He is now suing CNN for claiming that they libeled him for their characterizations of his discussion of ivermectin. And it's a big mess, again, because of the uncertainty and because, again, we are more and more susceptible to viral rumor mongering because of how polarized we are, because of how polarized our social media and our media consumption habits are, and just because of the amplifying effects of social media. Studies have shown that 12 individuals were responsible for 65% of the COVID misinformation on Facebook. And again, that suggests something significant, that there is a small number of people in management politics, the management policy. They often talk about the 20-80 rule, that 20% of your employees cause 80% of your problems. This is kind of a dramatic illustration of that reality, that a small number of people were producing an enormous amount of misinformation because they get caught up in what's going on and what the challenges are that are confronting us as society. And again, it reflects this problem that we have. And this goes back, when you had the terrible influenza outbreak of 1920 and 2021, Americans got, there were public health measures that, they shut down communities when spread of influenza got bad and when people started dying. And Americans rejected it. They protested it. And you had large community, Philadelphia, they had a terrible event where they had they said, we're holding a parade. It was parade schedule, we're going to run it. And like 100,000 people died as a result. And so it's, this is the problem that you have, that Americans they bridle at public health concerns. We are a highly individualistic society, and so our first impulse is going to be to protest and to say, what about my rights? I have a right to travel. I have a right to freedom of movement. The things that happened, for example, in Spain and Italy, where they had people doing shelter in place, where they literally could not leave their apartments for extended periods of time during moments of high transmission of COVID-19. China had, like a zero tolerance policy, where if there was any presence of COVID-19, they shut down entire communities for extended periods of time. They locked down their economy in ways that, again, Americans never experienced, but almost certainly never would have accepted. Okay? So how do we go about evaluating the news? This is a guy, Mike Caulfield. He's a research scientist at the Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington, in Washington State, I believe. And he basically says there are four things that we really need to think about when we're gathering news. The first thing to do is to stop. This is something I call, just keeping your skepticism, card open. Don't leap to conclusions, right? When you're viewing a claim on the internet, we should stop and ask yourself first, hey, do I know what I'm looking at? That's especially true if you have an emotional reaction to something. Then you look at the source. Take a look at the source. If the source is highly trusted, for example, a media source that engages in fact-checking and adheres to the norms of professional journalism, they issue corrections periodically, they have a basically high rating of reporting reliable news, then you can stop there. Third, compare. Look at other, how other news sites are covering the same events. A lot of times, if an event is a high valence event, meaning it's a high important event, you're going to find that there are other news sites that are going to cover it. Look at it from a conservative perspective and a liberal perspective, right? Look at it from multiple perspectives. Look at how mainstream journalists are covering it versus MSNBC or Fox News. Toggle back and forth and weigh, what's being said and how it's being interpreted. And then fourth, trace claims, quotes, and media, right? Back to the original context. If there's a link, click through to the original story or study. Or do a fresh search, on Google or your search engine with, again, relevant key words. Okay, so, what we're really doing is trying to identify a context, and we're recontextualizing, right? Investigating the claim and see if in a deeper, more embodied context. Again, these are things that take time. They're not easy to do, but if you have the basic skill set, and if you begin first with that skepticism, that's saying, what am I seeing here, and am I sure? My misinformation detector is engaged, right? Those are important things to think about when you're looking at these kinds of issues. Government regulation of the media. Their media organizations are regulated by the Federal Communications Commission. This is, again, a regulatory body. They regulate the airwaves. That means they regulate content on television and radio. They're there to try and maintain norms of decency. For many years, there could be no nudity at all on TV. Over time, those rules, I can't remember what the show was. It was one of the cop shows. They began showing a little bit of nudity. That was viewed as controversial. Over time, again, as people have gone more and more away from the big three, ABC, CBS, NBC, you're beginning to see some kind of loosening of those rules. One important regulatory one piece of legislation was the Telecommunications Act of 1996. That dramatically expanded the ability of media companies to own cross media, for television stations to own radio stations, and to own more kind of proportions of the media in particular locations. Each their viewing areas within the United States. And so media companies now can own larger and larger proportions of the media that exist in a given media area. And that has, again, had significant political consequences. In many parts of the Midwest and the Mountain West, small rural areas, they only get news from one news organization, from one media organization, and that is Sinclair, which is a conservative news outlet. And so you routinely get news that is skewed in a conservative direction. I talked about the equal time rule before. I honestly think that we should be going back to something like the equal time rule, where actually that was the fairness doctrine. The equal time rule is, if you appear in a story and it's negative, you have a right to purchase time to rebut it, right? The right of rebuttal refers to a journalistic practice where if you're the Washington Post and you're writing a story that is hostile to Donald Trump, you have the obligation to reach out to Donald Trump's campaign or his spokespeople and say, we're writing this story. Here's the information in it. Do you have anything to say? And if they say something, then you have to include it in your story. It's important to note, though, that with the equal time rule, all it means is that you are given the equal opportunity to purchase the airtime, and airtime is expensive. So that has a natural tendency to work to the disadvantage of people who don't have a lot of money, right? What are the effects of the media on our levels of knowledge and our overall tolerance? Okay? Is the media fostering a more intolerant environment? 85% of Americans believe that the tone and nature of our political debates has gotten more negative. And again, a big part of that are the media algorithms that are often, contributing to what I describe in this slide as ideological parochialism, where we are localized and where we are ideologically confined to our own ideological perspective. And again, I'll talk about this more when we get to our presentations on political parties. But it used to be that our political parties had, liberal and conservative wings. They were what we call catch-all parties. And that meant that internally, ideology was not the dominant thing that drove a political party. Okay? And that meant that they could speak internally within a conference or caucus to both liberals and conservatives. You are conversant in both, conservative speak and liberal speak. That meant that compromise was a lot easier to achieve in this period before partisan polarization began pulling us apart along ideological lines. Okay? Now the Democratic Party is a moderate to liberal party. The Republican Party is a moderate to conservative party. People within those kinds of time frames oftentimes mistake ideology for principle, right? As a conservative, for example, you would say, it's my principle that we should always be reducing the size of government. Well, what if reducing the size of government actually results in less, in bad things, right? One of the things that Helene has really kind of uncovered is that in many instances, the urge for Republicans to deregulate, for example, to remove regulations on safe housing, contributed to the disaster because, they were building on floodplains, right? They're building in areas that we know as a practical matter that if there is a flood, these homes are going to be destroyed, right? Why is this happening? Well, because people are saying less government, less government. Always less government. Oftentimes, less government also means you are less prepared for disasters. Disasters, when they hit harder because people are saying, well, we have to cut budgets. We have to always be seen reducing federal spending especially, right? So let's cut FEMA's budget. Okay? So what do you think? How widely do you and your friends and family seek out information? Do you and your family or friends tend to rely on a small number of sources, or do you reach out more broadly? How does that affect your perception of politics? I know, I teach media and politics at the college level. I have been a college professor for a quarter of a century. Okay, I have very wide, I cast a wide media net. I look at liberal media. I try to look at what I consider to be objective media. I look at conservative media routinely on a day-to-day basis. And yet I see stories and I see interviews where I hear somebody saying something that is clearly factually untrue, and it enrages me. And I think about, and in the middle when I'm thinking about if I were in front of that guy, I would punch him in the face. And then I think, my God, Ken, you have a PhD, you're a 61-year-old man, you ought to have a better control over your emotions. And it strikes home to me the extent to which we are being yanked around by the media for a profit. Okay? Can you identify a media outlet that you routinely read that effectively plays a watchdog role over government and politics? I routinely look at ProPublica because they, have really good stories, investigate. They're one of the few media outlets that are really devoted and have a budget to pursue investigative reporting. Investigative reporting has increasingly been reduced as a part of what media does because they are increasingly reliant on official news sources. They want to hear what elected officials and their staffers have to say, and they don't spend a lot of time digging in behind what officials are doing. And so you have a media that is at once more adversarial than it once was and less inclined to do the kind of investigative digging that you need to do in order to uncover corruption. Knowing what you know now, what do you think of investigations into online content and the debates over the responsibilities and liabilities of digital media companies like Facebook and Twitter? It's kind of like for many years, the wrestling organizations, they wanted to be licensed as sort of sports, but eventually they were compelled to concede. They really were entertainment, right? Sort of a similar thing needs to be happening in our conversations over Facebook and Twitter. They're claiming they're not media organizations, and yet they are taking advertising revenue that is the lifeblood of news organizations and then posting stuff that is irresponsible, and then they claim, no, we don't edit this content, therefore we're not a journalistic outfit. That seems disingenuous to me, and it strikes me as irresponsible. A lot of these folks just care, again, about making money, and greed. Self-interest and the desire for profit is the lifeblood of capitalism. It is how our economy revolves. Okay. At the same time, there is the hard reality that they have a First Amendment obligation to fulfill those three functions that I spoke about in these presentations. They have to be clear that they are informing the public and ensuring that the public has a way of knowing what is truthful information from misinformation and disinformation. They have an obligation to present, a forum where people can run for office and get to voters, what they stand on and why they should vote for them in a fair and impartial manner. And they also have to conduct those investigations that bring to light, problems, in how people use power in government. I can say, it's interesting, Bob Woodward, one of the two authors with Carl Bernstein that uncovered the Watergate scandal that brought Richard Nixon down, has recently published a book in which he basically revealed that Donald Trump sent COVID tests during, in 2020 when he was president. He sent COVID tests abroad to Vladimir Putin at a time when tests were very difficult to obtain. That is an important revelation that has significant consequences for how Americans ought to be viewing Donald Trump and his candidacy. We know how he behaved as president. There have been dozens of revelatory books. Many of his former supporters are now saying that the man is not fit to be president. And yet, again, you have a significant proportion of the American public that have closed themselves off from any hostile information regarding Donald Trump because they have decided that Donald Trump is their guy for right or wrong, for good or ill. This is the real troubling aspect of partisan polarization. So when we come back, we are going to take up two other really important sets of institutions. I'm going to talk a lot about the idea of intermediary institutions. These are the things that stand between the public and the formal institutions of government, Congress, the presidency, the federal courts. These are political parties, which I've already mentioned, and then interest groups. And in each in their way, they perform very important functions in the democratic process. In fact, one political scientist of the mid-20th century, E.E. Schattschneider, once said that democracy is unthinkable save in terms of political parties. And our political parties exist as alliances of interest groups. And together, they're the ones that do a lot of the movement towards what government is actually doing on a day-to-day basis. They are working to try to influence the government to do things that the people that are the adherents of those political parties and those interest groups want the government to do. So I'll see you next time.